do that. So I'm Elliot. I'm the treasurer of NICFA, and I work at Fort Hill Farm in New Milford. So this is the second of 3 of Farmer to Farmer Zooms that we've been putting on. This was going to be on greenhouse tomato growing. The last one is going to be in 2 weeks on December 13th at the same time, 6 o'clock. I'm still kind of pinning down the details on that, so I'm going to send that out as soon as I can, next few days. So I'm going to hand it over to MC, our wonderful coordinator, for a couple announcements, and then we're going to dive right in.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. So glad to see you all here to learn about greenhouse tomato growing from my very own boss at the farm that I work on, Steve Munno. I think we do a great job with our tomatoes, so I'm excited for the presentation. But I just wanted to give a little bit of background on the New Connecticut Farmer Alliance, some of the other things that we do, why you might want to become a member if you're not already. We host all sorts of farmer to farmer education opportunities like this. We have a seed variety discussion every year. In January, on January 27th, we're going to have a farmer to farmer conference. That's really going to highlight some of the expertise and leadership of the farmers in our organization. So I'm really excited for that. I'm going to put the link to our website in the chat so that you can become a member. And then also I'll put the URL for the Farmer to Farmer conference right after that. And if you want to register, it'll be on January 27th. I also want to give a big shout out to a pretty huge grant program that we're implementing right now for climate smart ag and forestry projects on farms in Connecticut. We have a whole lot of money to give out to support you and other folks in meeting some of our climate adaptation and mitigation goals on our farms. We know that farmers can be part of the solution to climate change, and that already you folks are innovating really exciting projects to sequester carbon, make your farms more resilient, respond to extreme weather events. And we really want to fund that work and make sure that we're building a more sustainable agricultural community in Connecticut. So the grant application is open right now. It closes on January 12th. We also have an info session coming up on December 5th. But I would really recommend anybody who's interested but might have some questions in reaching out to our program coordinator, Liz Castle. Their email is on that link that I just sent in the chat. And they're a really great resource if you just want to talk through a project and see if it's eligible. It's a pretty expansive definition of climate smart ag projects. So some things that might surprise you are on the list. For example, there's a bunch of stuff on there that doesn't qualify in the official NRCS list, but that we are really excited to fund. And then lastly, I just want to shout out our funding source for this event, the Transition to Organic Partnership Program, which is helping farmers across the country, but our region is focusing on the Northeast in either becoming certified organic, transitioning to organic, or just generally building our capacity to implement organic practices on our farms. There's a couple of fact sheets that I'd like to share with you about the program. I think most excitingly, there's a mentorship component of it. So I know some of y'all are participating in that already, which is awesome, but that aspect of the program is being administered by the Connecticut NOFA team, and they're matching new and beginning farmers or folks who are thinking about transitioning to organic or folks who have more to learn about organic practices with farmers like Steve and like some other folks in the room who are really well-versed in those practices, have been doing them for a long time, and have a lot of knowledge to share. So if that's something that you're at all interested in participating in, there's more info in the links that I just sent in the chat, or you can send me a message and I'd be happy to help you access any of those resources. So I think that that's all I've got, and can pass it back to Elliot, or maybe just straight to Steve for the presentation.
I was going to introduce Steve, and then we'll go for it. Thanks, MC. So our speaker tonight's newly elected official, Steve Munno. Steve and his crew, which includes MC, they operate Massaro Community Farm in Woodbridge. I'm going to let Steve introduce the farm and himself. He's going to be talking about greenhouse tomato production. He's going to present 5-10 minutes, and then so hold your questions or comments until he finishes up. And then we're going to open up the floor for questions or comments. And then, so MC is going to be kind of moderating the chat, so you can put questions in there. If you want to ask questions out loud, that's great too. Just use the little hand thing and we'll call on you. So, all right, we're going to hand it over to Steve.
Thanks, Elliot. Thanks, MC. So glad to see so many folks in the room here tonight. And that was just a good enough, long enough intro for me to fix the PowerPoint issues I was having too. So hopefully this is going to run smooth, but my computer just let me know how old it was as it was saying. I did not have enough memory to show the pictures in the slideshow. So that's its own issue, which is a good one to deal with in the winter. I'm going to share my screen here and hopefully everything is going to work smoothly on it. All right, so, just before getting directly into tomatoes, I wanted to just give an overview so there's some context on what our tomatoes are doing. I don't want to go too deep into, what Massaro is and all the things we do, but just from a growing perspective, we've been at this since 2010. That was our first year of production. And we were started with 4 acres and 125 CSA subscribers. We built a heated greenhouse that year and our first high tunnel. And then we've grown, sort of bit by bit each year ever since. We added a ½ acre, we built 2 movable tunnels, we added another ½ acre and then 2.5 more acres and then built 3 more tunnels. Thank you, NRCS, for making all of that possible, because otherwise we would not have any of these tunnels. After building 3 new tunnels, we rebuilt the movables and set them in place so they don't move anymore. And we made them 96-foot tunnels. And we've since built 2 caterpillar tunnels that are 14-foot wide and 96 feet long. And as of now, we grow mixed vegetables and flowers on 10 acres. We've got another 5 acres of pasture. We run a 20-week CSA from June through October for about 275 to 300 subscribers. We do a fall CSA, which is still going now, which will take us till Christmas. We have an amazing crew of people who make this happen. There's about 6 to 7 kind of core crew that are a mix of full-time and part-time, plus another 6 to 8 people, including youth that we hire for the summer to help all that go on. So that's the growing at the farm. Beyond that, here's just a little view of the property. So this is kind of our growing fields, and you can see some of our tunnels there. I don't know, can you see my mouse going around on it too or no? Okay, great. So there's our sort of heated greenhouse, our sort of high tunnel, which gets used for mixed use. It's an old view from 2014, so it shows our movable tunnels. They used to move back and forth, our 3 30 by 96, and now we also have 2 additional tunnels beyond that. That are the smaller ones. So that's what it looks like here. And then here's sort of a little more up-to-date view, but kind of a broader spectrum. We've got, these 2 are now 30 by 96. We've got 3 over here. I drew a potential future one over there, but we've kept that open. And there's 2 14 by 96 foot tunnels. So that's what it looks like. That's our growing area. This big field 2 area is our pasture, but this is our sort of 15 acres total that we grow on, and there's another 30 plus acres of woods and wetlands in the back there, and there's a trail and such through the woods. And that's when they were looking fresh and new some years ago, next to our field of cover crop. I'm going to do just a quick bit of high tunnel fundamentals before we get into tomato growing. So just some basics on here. And this is part, so you can see the Yukon tag on the bottom. So years ago, I gave, a few winters worth of high tunnel workshops, just, overall. And so I in fixing my computer issues just now, needed to bring up this old one and delete unnecessary slides to make it work, and happily it's working for us anyway. So thank you, Yukon, for supporting me those years and putting together the high tunnel workshops. Oh, this scrolled ahead. So key things: locating and orientation of them. So making sure that you if you're going to grow not just tomatoes but other things in your tunnels, you want your tunnels to be accessible year round. So when we look at this picture, our tunnels are all accessible. We've got an access road to all of them. It's sort of near the front of the property. We don't have tunnels way in the back of the property that we can't get to. We haven't had a heavy snow here in a long time, but in my 14 years here, we've certainly had winters with lots of snow, and I don't want to be needing to access the back of the property. So they're near to us, and though all of our high tunnels are unheated and don't have any power, They do have water to them, and so running water to them, it's helpful that they're near our wells and near our piping, and running electricity, running water, running those pipes, it can be expensive. And so, and if you can trench less and keep things close to you, it's definitely worth keeping tunnels close to you and accessible for year round. Growing them on quality soil, you're investing in a space where you're hoping to produce quite a lot. So making sure that the soil is quality soil, or amending it in advance of building, is worthwhile. Having level ground. You can grow them on hills, and I've seen them on hills where one side is higher than the other, but it's nice if they're level for a bunch of reasons. We orient ours all east to west, because then it gets a full southern exposure. And that's especially good for season extension, but you can orient them however is best for your site. But we typically do this east-west for that southern exposure on the long side. Again, as access to irrigation, and then prepping for water management is pretty key in the site prep, and I've got some pictures coming up on that. As I said before, the NRCS has made this all possible for us. So, a key thing is that it's got to be on ground that you're already growing on. You have to have a crop history. It's not a new tunnel in a new spot. So you need to have grown there before. And, depending on what their reimbursement rates are and the covering of the, and how much the materials cost, it might be 75%. It might be a little bit more, might be a little bit less. It all depends on sort of the details of your tunnels. But it was really key for us having that funding. So this is a quick view of the site prepared to shed water. So when we built this first tunnel, we built it up on the land, and when it rains, the rain rolls off the side and then goes into this kind of grassed waterway and travels away, which is really helpful to not have puddling in our tunnels. Now, that's the only tunnel we did it with. Then you can see this in this crazy storm. It's nice that it all rolled down there and the water traveled away. This other tunnel wasn't built like that. And after the fact, we've put in some drainage along the side. So there are now, we didn't build it up. This was kind of a growing field with nice crops in it that we just built the tunnel over. We ended up having some puddling issues on the sides of the tunnels, or just on the sort of inner beds. And we've ended up putting in drainage on the outside. And again, we went to the NRCS for that as well. So they dug, a sort of a 2-foot trench, put in perforated piping a few feet down, and then covered it with gravel. And we haven't had any issues since. Even this year, super wet, super rain, no puddles inside. And here's what some of that looked like for us. So when we got these heavy rains, eventually there's nowhere else for the water to go. So even though it's rolling off of the side, it was kind of seeping back in, and those edge beds, having puddles near the edges, it's just not helpful for us to grow. This is key space for us that we're relying on, and these are no conditions to be doing it in. So documenting these things is always helpful too. So if you want the NRCS to help fund something and cost share or practice, documenting the issues, letting them know. So we take these pictures, I call my NRCS agent, I send them the pictures in an email and say, hey, we need to address this, and they've been super helpful in getting that done. All right, we're just getting into some things. This is a little out of order since I was kind of throwing this together to repair the computer at the last minute, but our friends over at Off Center Farm here in Woodbridge, this is the picture of their cherry tomatoes in the middle of their caterpillar tunnel. Here's a quick look at some of our grafted tomatoes. I always think they sort of look like palm trees with tomatoes hanging off them. They're all pruned up, lots of tomatoes hanging off them. We've got basil planted in between there. This is a determinate tomato, a BHN 589 with basil along the side of it. There's another quick view of that as they trellis them up. You don't have to do those along lines. You can do those with wooden stakes too, but it's an old view of some of our stuff. And I'm going to just go over a few more things before we can get into questions, just so it's laid out for you. So planting and sowing dates. We do multiple sowings of tomatoes from early March to mid-April. Plan on them being in the greenhouse for 6 to 8 weeks. Sow in the strips, pot them up. And then we plan on the last week of April or the first week of May to do our plantings. Our tunnels are all unheated. You could do this much earlier if you have heated tunnels. You might start your tomatoes in January and plant them in March and then have fruit in June. But for us with unheated tunnels, we can get a frost, and we've had a few frosts in early May. and that'll, it could potentially kill your plants or severely delay them. And, rather than setting them out and having them inhibited through cold injury, we try to make sure there is no damage to them. We keep them in our heated greenhouse until, we know there's no danger for them out in the tunnel. So that's generally been reliable for us to plant the last week of April. But I think 2 of the last 3 years we've had, a cold snap in early May, and we've waited till after that to plant. We have purchased grafted plants. We did that for a number of years. And, I hope it's not our fault that we bought these things from companies that then went under and don't exist anymore, but they don't exist anymore. We liked their products. I wish they still were out there, but this was the first year in a while that we did no grafted plants. We did all high tunnel varieties from either Johnny's or High Mowing, and they worked really well. So, for years we did grafted plants. After years of not doing grafted plants, the grafted plants were extraordinary, I thought, but I would say this year we did fine without them. We still had plenty of tomatoes, and we spent much less money doing it. So there's that. We can talk a little bit about grafted plants if people want to do that, but I don't have grafting expertise. We tried some grafting a little while ago, and then we're happy to leave that to people who are doing it really well and buying it in. And part of that is about space setup and such, but, having dedicated space for it. But anyway, we've moved on to, now using our own plants that we grow from seed instead of doing grafted plants, and just using high tunnel specific varieties. And then lastly, there's a lot of detail on this slide, but this is kind of how we're set up. And at the bottom is the kind of the resource that we've used that kind of switched everything in terms of our setup. The Greenhouse and Hoop House Growers Handbook by Andrew Meffert. He actually was here a few years ago and gave a presentation that kind of suggested a whole different planting setup and spacing setup based on how tomatoes and peppers and eggplants are grown in greenhouses in Holland. And he brought that info back, and so we've made the switch. So what we have now in our 30 by 96 foot tunnels are, 6 beds. The beds are only 2 foot wide, but the paths are 3 foot wide. So there's a lot of space to move, which you kind of need for working in there. And it also allows for a lot of airflow. The outermost paths close to the sides of the tunnels are only 18-inch, but all the other paths are 3 foot wide. We use black fabric over the soil, and then there are holes cut in for the planting at the spacing that we use, which is 12 inches. The nice thing about that is we can, we've now folded that up and taken it out, and next year when we're ready to plant, we're going to just roll that back out, staple it in place, and then we put white fabric over the paths, and that helps for reflecting the light back up there, which helps the tomatoes grow. We grow the tomatoes just in the 4 center rows, so the 2 outer beds, or in the 4 center beds. The 2 outer beds we've grown basil in. But I know that there are other folks who grow peppers or eggplants, which don't grow as large. So that's an option, or you can grow any other crop you like. But basil's been a nice pair for it. I like the interplanting of the basil as well, just for pest protection. And we also use marigolds at the end of the bed, which I just feel like has just been helpful for pests. We put 4 lines of drip on each bed. So we're demanding a lot of production out of these tomatoes, so they need a lot of resources. So, because we're growing in the fabric, we're not doing any additional fertilizer after we've planted. So there's sort of pre-plant fertilizer, and then we've got 4 rows of drip to make sure they have adequate water, but we're also adding fertility in the water as well, with nearly every planting. And we'll adjust the fertility as the season goes. So there's that, and then the trellising is pretty key. So these are all in, they're all climbing up a line, and they've got a double leader. So each plant is becoming, we're pruning them and then making a double leader, and so it's kind of a V. And there is a trellis line. There's actually 2 trellis lines above each bed, and it looks really beautiful in there. Actually, I think it's kind of a fun thing to see. And each plant or alternating plants are trellised in opposite directions. So it gives them sort of room to grow. And Andrew Meffert's book has a really great graphic on this to sort of lay that out, and also trellising ideas for other plants as well. But that's where we, brought this in from. So, prior to this method, we had done single leader, and trellis them straight up, but this has given us a lot more room. I think it's a lot more worker friendly to have the 3-foot beds instead of, you know, having 6 or 8 beds with 18-inch paths, which is what we do for our greens and other crops in the tunnels. So shifting the spacing is its own challenge, but now we've got trellis set up in a few tunnels for this. And it's been a really good method for us to we're actually getting more plants in, you know, planted densely. And with the double sort of leader out of each plant, we're getting a really great harvest out of it. So this worked well, both with our grafted plants and our not grafted plants that we use now. All right, so I just spilled a whole lot of information there. That's sort of all the stuff, and I wanted to just leave it there for now, so we can go to sort of questions and conversation and such on it. That's the sort of quick overview of all the things on this.
Thank you so much, Steve. Excellent presentation. All right, so if you want to start, folks, you can feel free to drop a questions or comments in the chat. It could be about what Steve presented or other questions or comments just related to greenhouse tomatoes, or if you want to say it out loud, just put your hand up and we'll call on you.
I'm just going to address one question I saw from Paul about the in-ground production, just because it's the top on the chat for me at the moment. And just because I reached out to my organic certifier, Bay State, this week to ask about growing in containers. And our organic certifier does require it to be soil grown. So they, for some period of time, had allowed for growing in bags or growing in containers in tunnels, but they won't certify that anymore. Organic certification requires organic soil management. And so that was the response I had from them. I sort of wondered about sneaking some things in pots, you know, for periods of time, as things transition one thing to another. But we got a very clear answer from Bay State is they won't certify anything grown in. So that doesn't address your question, Paul, about the NRCS. I think NRCS is okay with things being grown in pots, but you know, your organic certifier may not be.
Hey, Steve, great talk. Just to clarify, I'm Lauren Henderson Tomowski, who worked on our farm a bunch of years. I think she told me that maybe in New York, they don't require the ground to have been in production. And that's what I was getting at more than pots or bags. So, and I don't know I really don't know the answer, but you're correct. As far as I knew up until about a year ago, yeah, it had to be ground that was in production, but I don't know if that's still true. And it's probably worth an ask if you're a new farmer and you don't have, haven't grown anything there yet.
Totally. Yeah, I think they had good reasoning for it, but do check up on with your agent to see about it. But I think they want to see, reliable growing in an area where they're going to put a tunnel, or at least that was their rationale before. Yeah.
Will, do you want to ask your question next, and then we can go back to the chat?
Yeah, this was back to the drainage issue that Steve raised before. We just put up 2 high tunnels within RCS, finished them last week, and just more of a word of caution for folks. To dig the drains, which is considered the best practice now, along the side of the tunnel, they're going to send out an archaeologist to the farm to make sure you're not disturbing important cultural sites. And on our farm, they found Native American artifacts dating back to 1000 AD in every hole they dug. They dug 9 holes. So there are some alternatives, as Steve said, just doing some earthwork to create drainage off the sides is an option. But they've also been pushing adding gutters to collect rainwater as an option. I'm not totally sold on the management of that because it's something you have to remove each season and put back on before the snow. But it could be helpful too for irrigation if you have large enough cisterns to drain that into, which I think is also part of the NRCS practice. Susan, once they found that stuff, they just told us we can't pay for you to dig. You can still build the tunnel. You could still put the drains in. We would have to pay for it ourselves. So for now, we're just gonna go for it and see what happens and figure it out later.
Oh, that's wild. Okay, Yoko asks, hi Steve, how much fertilizer do you give them, nitrogen per acre, initial and ongoing, and what you use? Also, how much water do you give them?
All right. So it depends, and so we'll do soil tests in the tunnel, and we were actually part of a study a few years ago that University of Rhode Island and UConn did together on high tunnel production. I don't know if they've put out the reports, and there was kind of like a mid-study update, but I don't know if they've put out the final studies on it. But I can tell you, among the growers that they were surveying, we were using the least amount of fertilizer, which they were letting me know as we went. And I think how much fertilizer you put in might push them, especially on the nitrogen front, to grow much more vigorously or run hotter, and I'm sort of less inclined to do that in general. I feel like we've been getting lots of tomatoes with what we've done, and I should have my records up in front of me, but I don't, so I'm just going to have to give you sort of an estimate. But in our 30 by 96 foot tunnel, we've been using something we've gotten from Seven Springs, which is like there's a 909 fertilizer, and I want to say it's a 1355. We've been using like 50-pound bags worth of that, and we've used a few different fertilizers in there as well. I want to pull up my notes so I can tell you exactly, but I don't have them up right now. So I might get back to exactly how much fertilizer we've used on the pre-plant. And then in terms of the drip, once that's in, and I see there's also a question like, how long do we run the drip? That sort of changes throughout the season. So when they're young, and sort of this kind of goes for any plant, when their roots aren't running deep, you need to water them more frequently and less deeply, but you need to water past their root zone so their roots will go deeper. But then as they are mature, they've got a much bigger root system. They need water longer, but less frequently. And so then it also does depend on the conditions, how hot it's been and such. I didn't note this in my presentation earlier, but I should say for the last few years, we've also been using shade cloth. We use a 30% shade cloth on the tunnel. And I think that's been really helpful as well. For a bunch of years, I wasn't sure it was necessary. We'd get the odd hot spell that would maybe kill off a set of flowers, because when it gets super hot, when you have these heat waves above 90 degrees for a bunch of days, the flowers will drop, or fruit will stop expanding, because that's one of the protection mechanisms for the plants to preserve itself. But climate change and extended heat periods have become more and more frequent, and so we invested in the shade cloth, and now we are using that wherever we grow tunnels. So we usually have 2 tunnels full of tomatoes, and they will have shade cloth on them. So that was a quick side note. But yeah, so the drip tape, those 4 lines on each bed, we're often running them in the height of the season for 90 minutes to get a thorough amount of water on them. I think Andrew Meffert's book will advise like multiple waterings a day, because that's better for the sort of shallower but spread root system of the tomato. But we can't really do that. Like in the height of the summer, our farm is zoned to water in different places, and I can't go back to watering that, 6 times a day for 20 minutes. He's got some recommendations in there that just aren't feasible for us as a diverse farm doing a bunch of different things. If tomatoes were the one thing that we were growing, I would look to his advice on that. But we're not doing it that way. So it's usually, 3 times a week is kind of about every other day, 90 minutes of water. But again, it does depend on what the conditions are. And earlier in the season, when they're just starting to grow, it's going to be, not quite as long. It might be a 30-minute water because they've just been planted. But again, and we've got those 4 lines of drip because you end up with this sort of channeling. You've got a 2-foot wide bed and a 3-foot wide path. The roots are going to spread, but you don't want them to get killed off. By dry zones. So in order for those roots to spread, there needs to be, soil that they want to go to. So if you aren't watering the soil for they go to, if they're going to end up at a dry, hydrophobic block, those roots aren't going to expand anywhere. So that's why we're sort of getting it past their root system early on, and then more later. And then the fertigation we include in there is going to be, more towards encouraging growth, vegetative growth early in the season. So we have a soluble nitrogen that will go into our drip system, and we try to add calcium early on as well. So often the first flush of fruit is going to have some blossom end rot. But we've really missed that entirely at this point in the tunnels. And oftentimes it happens because the temperature, even if you have the right amount of calcium, even if your pH is perfect, sometimes that calcium isn't accessible at certain temperatures. So feeding it through the drip allows the plant to uptake it earlier. So we often have calcium in there, but essentially we've got we get a liquid calcium. I think that also comes from Seven Springs, and we use a kelp. We use the maxi kelp. That's like a 00. I forget what it is, the last number on it. Sorry, I don't have my fertilizer info in front of me still, but so we're often doing a mix of nitrogen and kelp for the season. And our advice from the folks at URI and UConn were to give it more nitrogen, but once there's a lot of fruit on there, we kind of back off on that, on the nitrogen, and stick with the kelp on there. So it's that maxi crop kelp that we're just putting in a 5-gallon bucket, mixing it in. I think it's a quarter cup that's going in there, and yeah.
I think I'm going to bring us to Matt's question next, and then Diane, you can ask your question. Matt asks if we're growing determinate tomatoes and if we prune them, and if so, what's their technique? What's the technique?
So we do grow the BHN 589s in there. That's a red determinate tomato from Johnny's. That's a great tunnel producer, and that's often the one that we've done kind of as a little later planting. And we prune it, but only sort of bottom leaves. We do a one-time pruning, bottom leaves for airflow, and otherwise leave it alone. So we don't do any other pruning in that. Our indeterminate tomatoes that we grow are getting pruned and trellis weekly, and maybe even twice a week, depending if we can get to it. Sort of ideally it might happen twice a week. Ideally it might happen, if you were only growing tomatoes, you might be in there every day. But with the mix of things we do, we try to target one day a week where it's definitely happening. And if we can do it more, we will.
Diane, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, hi Steve. I'm curious if you can speak to how you manage your soil once you're done with your tomatoes, like how you deal with salt buildup, if you cover crop. So yeah, sort of what's your long-term vision of the space and management of that?
So one of the tunnels now, for the last few years since we started to have laying hens on a bigger level, has gone from tomatoes to hens to tomatoes to hens. So as soon as the tomatoes are up, we put in a sort of cover crop pasture mix of winter rye and clover and peas and oats for the chickens, and they are in there until early March, and then they move out, and we mow what's left if there's anything left and turn that in. We use a BCS with a little rototiller to till that in, and then we've got enough separation by taking them out then for sort of your crop safety to plant at the end of April, and not harvest until July from that manure to there. So that's sort of been a cycle for a few years now in one of our tunnels. And the rest of it, because we have multiple tunnels, we can kind of rotate having tomatoes in them. And actually, the URI and Yukon study made us keep tunnels in one space because that's what a lot of growers do, is use, so we kept there for a few years in a row. But otherwise, we've moved our tomatoes around, so they're getting a mix of different things. And the salt buildup, I think, has often been from manure-based composts, in which we've largely stayed away from. So alfalfa meal has been one of our main sources. There is some animal-based stuff in like the feed and grow, which is something we use, which is like a 5-4-3 that has some blood meal and bone meal, but we're using them in small quantities, and our soil tests aren't showing salt buildups that are concerning. But one of the ways to deal with a salt buildup, if it does happen, is just to try to flush it out. So we've only had, in our years, we've only had to remove the plastic, once or twice. But if we can have a period where there's plastic off and it's getting rained on, or, we have irrigation available in all of our tunnels. So trying to give a good flush of water. So, after those tomatoes are out, because it's been in fabric, because it's been walked on, it's kind of a sheer bit of soil. Which then, again, we're doing the work either by hand or with a BCS in there. And I can go through with a little chisel plow on the BCS to kind of break that up and then soak it. We've got the sprinklers in there to kind of soak that through, and then we're either preparing for the next crop by either putting in a cover crop or putting down new compost. So we make some compost on site, so we might bring some of that in. So it really depends. So there's not like a clear answer, but because we can rotate tunnels, it's helpful. And it'll depend on what our needs are for the next crop, sort of what we do after the tomatoes. But one tunnel has this cycle now for a few years, and if that becomes an issue and we need to move tomatoes out of there, we will. But it's been a few good years in there with that sort of tomato cover crop, pasture, chickens, and then tomatoes again.
Thanks. I think Lisa's question about how long and often we run the drip was already addressed. So I'm going to direct us to Holly's not dumb at all question, which is a follow-up to the NRCS requirements for funding a tunnel. And do they only fund tunnels that are on proven ground where you've already successfully grown? Does that mean that you'd have to grow, say, field tomatoes in a particular spot and only then put a tunnel up over that very spot? Or do they mean that the whole farm just has to be proven?
I think just the specific location where you want to put a tunnel, they just want to know that there's a crop history there, and it doesn't have to be what you plan to grow in the tunnel. So that's been my sort of past experience with them. It's like, you've grown something there, you can put a tunnel there, and you don't have to grow tomatoes in there to then grow tomatoes in the tunnel there. You could have grown anything, and a cover crop might even be sufficient. But I would document whatever you would do, whatever you put there, and let them know. But I know people have different experiences with the NRCS agents. We are close to the Hamden office. They've been wonderful over the years, and people have changed, moved around, and they've been very helpful. So but I think they just mean, at least my experience was they just want to see that you've actually grown there before. And I would recommend that for you too, like knowing that you don't want to come up with a brand new issue in a new spot. Like you should know that if you're investing in that space, that there's not some unforeseen issue.
Totally. And then Lisa's asking, how do you trellis determinants?
We've done it just like we've done it in the field with field stakes, and then kind of weaving them with the trellis lines. But now at this point, most of our tunnels have some trellis lines already connected in the ceilings and spools to pull down. So we're pretty much all using these what do they call them, the little roller wheels. We just pull the string down and clip to them. But if you don't have that set up, if you don't want to set it up, you don't have to. You can stake them. They're less demanding than the indeterminates. The indeterminates grow, to the top of the tunnel, basically. Now ours, because we're not doing it in a heated tunnel, we're not doing it quite as early as some others might do. We have yet to really need to lower and lean. We haven't had, this year was the one year actually got close where we really could have done it. but because they're getting planted a little later and we're not really trying to push them into November, we often clear our tomatoes out in early October so that we can plant greens for the winter. We're doing a sort of top cut in mid-August to stop the generative growth at the top and sort of force fruit below it. So we're cutting off those leaders around August 15th. And just getting whatever generates over the next 6 weeks and removing those tomatoes. So my take on tomatoes is, late in the season, is they're just not all that delicious. They're usable in different ways, but without the longer days and heat, they don't taste as good. And I think our space is more valuable transitioning the tunnels to greens than it is keeping the tomatoes in there longer. So yeah, we haven't had to do the lower and lean trellising model, but it is doable, and I know there are folks on here who do it, and might be in our future someday. The cherry tomatoes are the one that do get really big. So I should say, and I don't think I shared before, but we've grown lots of varieties of tomatoes, and the cherry tomatoes, are sort of the quickest to harvest, and they grow the biggest, or sort of the tallest. They might really need it. So we've grown in the tunnels this year. We're growing Torrangina, Sakura, and Sun Peach, I think all of which were from Johnny's. We've grown Torrangina and Sakura for a few years, and this was our first year growing Sun Peach, and they're incredibly productive. And then in terms of our bigger tomatoes, we've grown lots over the years, but this year doing none that were grafted. We did, a mix of things from High Mowing and Johnny's, and we had Mai Tai, Hot Streak, Grandero. Maybe I can put this in the chat too, but Tomimaro Mucho, sort of a Japanese pink variety, Pink Wonder, Rebelski. Those have kind of been ones that we've grown just from seed and done in there. And the BHN 589s, which I kind of think of those as separate as the determinants than from the other ones, but we've kind of used those also as a backup. Like if something went wrong, we have something we can stick in the tunnel that will work well. And having tried varieties that don't work well in the tunnel, that aren't sort of designated as tunnel tomatoes, I would recommend not growing a tomato that isn't meant to be grown in a tunnel or it hasn't been trialed. Leaf mold is like a sort of key disease that comes up, and all of these tunnel varieties have resistance to the diseases that come up in the tunnel. Either doing tunnel varieties or grafted tomatoes that have that built-in protection from their rootstock will prevent lots of potential problems. So in our early years, I tried some varieties that I liked, and they did okay, but they had issues, and those issues can spread to other things. So we really tried to stick with proven tunnel varieties.
Does anybody who does lower and lean their trellis tunnel tomatoes want to speak to Elliot's question about preventing the first cluster of tomatoes from hitting the ground when you go lower and lean the first time? Or a method for folks who might not know what exactly it looks like? Anyone?
Well, I feel like I could describe it, but I haven't done it. So I've only read about it and seen it in videos.
Elliot, do you want to describe what y'all do?
Well, the trouble is we got we use the Q-lipper system. It's the you Google it. It's you got like two foam clips, and then essentially you that's what you connect to your string, and you work it down. But the problem is by the time where you're at the point where we want to lower them, but then if you lowered it, you'd hit the ground because tomatoes are still green. So we saw something called a wicket that Connor Crickmore sells. It's just kind of expensive, and I'm just kind of curious if other people are running into the same problem who are into lowering and leaning. And then I guess a side shoot would be if you're lowering and leading cherry tomatoes, there's so many leaders. Are you pruning the leaders really hard then on the cherries? Because we just kind of clip a whole bunch because we'd have no way to lower them.
We prune our cherries pretty hard. I basically do like the umbrella where I'll let them go up on a single leader till about my own reach, which is the tallest on the farm, and then kind of basically let it go. You could like top it at some point so it doesn't like get too crazy, but eventually it gets crazy because usually by the time I'm doing that and getting cherry tomatoes, they'll cascade back down. It gets a bit jungly, but
How long about Footprint Farm?
Dakota's Footprint Farm has a good system for doing it.
Yeah, I think that they use the wickets. And Elliot, correct me if I'm wrong, but the wicket is basically like for the leaned over tomatoes to like lean on for extra support.
Yeah, I think it's kind of just like a kind of a squarish hoop. I guess the hoop's not a square, but kind of it's more of a squared off hoop that I think you can rest the stem of the plant on, so that instead of leaning down to the ground, like you can keep the first cluster up of fruit so it doesn't, drop it into the ground.
Yeah, I would say that in practice, our system also tends to be the prune the cherry tomatoes until you can't reach the leaders anymore system.
Yeah, if we can avoid time on ladders, I always feel like that's better and safer.
Any
Okay,
other
oh,
questions?
sorry. I had a follow-up question to my own
Yeah,
question.
yeah.
How aggressive are people with the we can never kind of decide like how hard to prune the bottom leaves, like because I've seen some folks like really just go really hard on it and the plant looks like it's got like not a lot of leaves at all. Other people don't. Like, does anyone feel like really confident or successful in their amount of aggression when they're pruning lower leaves?
Right? Anytime with alloy or child support, and I think it's I'm not sure the savings accounts can be tied together with your.
Elliot, I'll say we pruned more aggressively this year for the first time ever, like quite serious. To the point where, yeah, I've seen people even go more hardcore, but very skeletal until I don't know, at least 2 to 3 feet above the ground surface. And yeah, it's a little scary doing it. And it looks strange, but again, I've seen people do it like consistently like that with a lot of success. And I do think it was helpful for disease prevention and airflow movement. So, I mean, that's just anecdotal, but
We generally try to keep the plants when we have time pruned to like 1/3 up from proportionally however big they are. I have found that once you go too high, you can run into like sunburn issues on those like bare fruit sets. But I think you're right, 2-3 feet, maybe 3.5 feet. If you can get away with it, and it does like basically just prevents that disease from coming in sooner. It's gonna come anyway, but yeah.
I'm seeing other folks in the chat echo that pruning aggressively helps avoid splash up from the ground and helps with airflow, and that root yields were high and it helped with airflow. Does anyone want to speak to Stephen's question about whether you're also pruning heirloom varieties just as hard?
Sorry, I was actually responding to the Steve's entry about varieties.
Yeah. Yeah, basically no heirlooms in there. And I've seen, and we've did a few years ago, I think we got a grafted Cherokee purple, but they're just not built to produce that way. So there are some great varieties that mimic the heirlooms, which I've heard called high looms. So if you wanted a Cherokee purple, Marnero is what you would grow. That looks just like it from Johnny's, a French variety. So the Marbonne, Marnero, and Margold. Margold is kind of like a striped German. These are really good varieties that are just built to be in these conditions and are far more productive than the heirlooms will ever be. So love the heirlooms, continue to grow them outside as you like, but I'd say do not grow them in the tunnels, or you won't get much. They're not built for that.
Thanks.
So we just got a couple minutes left before everyone takes off. Just want to thank everyone for coming out and having great questions, and it's nice to see everyone. If Steve's willing to hang out for a few minutes and you've got some burning questions, we'll keep the Zoom open for a while. If people want to hang out and discuss more tomato stuff. Otherwise, yeah, if any last questions, if you want to shout them out or throw them in the chat. And then, yeah, so then just look out for the next one more of these in 2 weeks. And we hope to see you there as well.
If there aren't people, if you still want to think on questions, I'll just share a few random bits that didn't come up. Disease management and the pruning really speaks to a lot of the stuff that can happen with leaves and foliar disease. And the one thing that we probably do about once a season is spray oxidate in the tunnels on the leaves. So to kill off any leaf mold or any kind of foliar disease that we see. So a little backpack sprayer. So that's organically approved and something that it's this kind of the only treatment we've had to use in the tunnels, except for actually more recently we've had a little bit of white fly issues. And from Arbico Organics, I order a set of cards, and they're a little card with their predatory wasp on there, and we drop them throughout the tunnel, and we get them. We get 3 orders of them, I think 2 weeks apart, and we've managed them just fine. I've done spot spraying, like if there's been a soapy spray, when there's a sort of a hatching, on a plant. So we'll usually see one plant that's got a lot of them, and we'll try to spray that with soap right away. And, but the cards have been really helpful, and that's really all we've had to do. And I think the basil and the marigolds, having them around, some flowering interest around there has helped with, keeping our beneficials around. We haven't seen a tomato hornworm, infestation ever. We've seen 1 or 2 here and there, but we're not overrun by any kind of pests. We haven't had any kind of major issues with pest or disease in there yet.
I just wanted to mention on the grafting note, we've trialed a couple things the past couple years, because last year we did like half our heirlooms grafted and half not grafted, and planted some of those like heirloom lookalike F1s from Johnny's. And the grafting definitely is a must for heirlooms in the greenhouse, but this year we got away with grafting all of them, and they did pretty well solidly throughout the year. The only issue I have with the Johnny's heirloom lookalikes is that I found that their flavor wasn't quite the same, like as good. But the grafting, if you're not comfortable doing it, it's definitely a lot, but worth it I think if it's important to grow heirlooms in the greenhouse.
Matt, I'm curious if yours were as productive. Like, so the 1 year that we got a couple of grafted heirlooms that we bought in, they just weren't as productive as the other plants either. They were good, and it was nice to have them, but I just felt like we were investing in grafted plants. They weren't giving us the same production. But we also do grow stuff in the field too, so we can kind of balance like having a bounty in our tunnels and having, you know, some of the more unique varieties, and a mix of things in the field.
Yeah, they're definitely like a little flushy, where you get a really heavy fruit set. So we just plan for them being our like earliest tomato we put in or try for that. So we have a grow room. We're starting seeds in like January they need like a lot of time in the graft period to like reestablish on the rootstock and like get some vigor before you go and put them out. But this year I put them in our most fertile house, and they pretty much like went all season at a pretty nice clip. I mean, it fell off after the initial set, but we also pruned almost nothing. So the ungrafted heirlooms I found they just get diseased so quick. And so they never last even maybe that first fruit set, and then they're pretty much done.
I see Kyle's question there. I'll say our plants have still been healthy. Like they still look good. They're just not producing as much. You know, things just don't ripen as fast when you're losing daylight so rapidly. You know, you really see it drop off in late September. It seems pretty solid through mid-September, and then you know, the plants are healthy, but they're just not pumping out at the same rate. We're not getting the same ripening rate, and you know, I suppose we could think about removing shade cloth at that point, but you know, really we're ready to move on. And we pull a lot of green tomatoes, you know, late September, early October, so that we can move on, and whether we make a green tomato salsa at that time or just give the tomatoes out as green, I think that we're sort of better served that way. That's just our take on it. But so yeah, they're not diseased or senescing, but I guess I would say some of the varieties over the years have been, but you know, whether they were grafted or they were sort of tunnel variety, or tunnel specific varieties, they've been fine.
How do you know when do you usually put the shade cloth on the houses? Do you based on like the temperature, or do you just do it at a certain date? Or
this year was so cold and rainy in June, it didn't happen until the end of June. So it really depends. You know, it's not on in April, and I would say I think 2 years ago we did it just before Memorial Day. There was like a 90-degree, you know, week. You know, we had like 3 or 4 days in a row, and you know, we were starting to see, you know, the maybe the first set of flowers, and just felt like, hey, we got to do this right now. Like, I don't know if it's going to be 95 degrees for the next month or not. So it's varied. We're kind of watching it, but you know, it takes us, you know, we got to plan for, you know, an hour or so. It doesn't take that long, but we need a block of time to do it. And when it's not super windy, so it's going to be, we're just watching the weather. So it could be anywhere from mid-May, and this year was pretty late, being late June. I think we got all of our tunnels covered with shade cloth, because we do it on our 2 pat tunnels for other crops, and the 2 tunnels with tomatoes. I think we did them all like the last week of June and before 4th of July.
All right, any last questions from the peanut gallery or the chat? Cool.
I just threw my email in there if you want, if anybody has things. I know there were some questions I couldn't quite address. Sorry, I wasn't quite prepared, especially on fertility specifics, but I'm happy to share coming later.
all right, well, thanks everyone so much, and especially Steve. Thank you for taking the time. We know you're a busy guy. So yeah, thanks everyone for coming. Thank you, Steve. And then watch your email for the last Farmer to Farmer. So hope everyone has a great week.
All right, thanks everyone.
Thanks, everyone. if you want to revisit this, the recording will be on our YouTube page.